Sometimes the most broken people find each other when they need it most. Sometimes a child's simple question can crack open a heart that's been closed for years. 61-year-old Everett Cole lives alone in an alley with just a sleeping bag and a doghouse he built for the dog he lost. He's been invisible to the world for 3 years. Then one rainy afternoon, 6-year-old Zora appears, soaked and scared, asking if she can sleep in his doghouse. She's run away from another foster home, and her mother is nowhere to be found. What happens when these two lost souls meet in the most unlikely place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alley behind Murphy's corner store held the kind of quiet that only comes at 4 in the morning. Everett Cole sat with his back against the brick wall, watching steam rise from his dented thermos like small prayers ascending to heaven. The coffee was weak, made from grounds he'd stretched for 3 days, but it was warm, and warmth was currency in a world that had grown cold around him. At 61, Everett had mastered the art of invisibility. His beard, once neatly trimmed, for parent-teacher conferences, now grew wild and grey. His clothes, layered for warmth rather than appearance, made him blend into the urban landscape like another shadow. People walked past the mouth of the alley without looking in, their minds focused on destinations that didn't include acknowledging the man who lived between their daily routines. The doghouse sat beside him, constructed from discarded plywood and sealed with tar he'd found behind a construction site. It was sturdy enough to weather the storms, painted a faded blue that reminded him of better days. Rex would have loved it, the German shepherd mix who'd been his only companion through the hardest winter of his life. But Rex was gone now, claimed by the bitter cold last February, leaving behind only this wooden monument to loyalty and the hollow ache of being truly alone. Everett's fingers traced the rim of his thermos, feeling the dents that told stories of dropped mornings and hurried escapes when the police moved him along. Each mark was a day survived, a small victory in a war he hadn't chosen to fight. The thermos had been a gift from his students, 4th graders at Riverside Elementary, who'd pooled their lunch money to buy their favorite teacher something special for Christmas. That was another lifetime ago, when his name meant something. Besides that homeless man behind the store, Murphy Kowalski knew his name, though. The 70-something store owner, with hands like leather and a heart softer than he'd admit, had been the first person in 3 years to look Everett in the eye and ask how he was doing. Not the perfunctory, "How are you?" that people tossed around like spare change, but the real question that expected an honest answer. "Morning, Professor," Murphy would say when he came out to empty the trash. The nickname had stuck after Murphy learned about Everett's teaching background during one of their early morning conversations. It was spoken with respect, not mockery, and Everett had come to treasure those moments when someone remembered he used to matter. The memories came easier in the pre-dawn hours when the city held its breath. Everett would close his eyes and hear the sound of children's laughter echoing through classroom walls, feel the weight of small hands tugging at his sleeve with urgent questions about music theory or the proper way to hold drumsticks. He'd been good at his job, more than good. For 15 years, he'd coaxed melodies from reluctant voices and watched shy children bloom under the patient guidance of a man who believed every child had a song worth singing. The Teacher of the Year plaque had hung in his classroom for 3 years running. Parents requested his classes specifically, knowing their children would emerge not just musically educated, but genuinely cared for. Everett had possessed the rare gift of seeing potential where others saw problems, of hearing harmony in the chaotic noise of childhood. But gifts, he'd learned, could be taken away as quickly as they were given. The accusations had started small, whispers about inappropriate attention, suggestions that his dedication to struggling students stemmed from something darker than genuine care. False allegations. that spread like wildfire through the school district, turning colleagues into strangers and transforming parents' grateful smiles into suspicious glares. Even after the investigation cleared him completely, even after the truth emerged about the disturbed parent who'd fabricated the claims out of spite, the damage had been done. No one wanted to hire the teacher who'd been accused, even if proven innocent. The shadow of suspicion followed him from interview to interview, turning his years of dedication into a liability. Savings dwindled as months passed without work. Then came the eviction notice, the foreclosure, the slow slide from middle-class respectability into the invisible world of those who'd simply run out of chances. Rex had found him during the worst of it, appearing one night outside the shelter like an answer to prayers he'd stopped believing would be heard. The dog was battle-scarred and suspicious, probably abandoned by someone else who'd run out of options. They'd recognized something in each other, that look of having loved and lost, of being discarded by a world that no longer saw value in what they had to offer. For 2 years, they'd been a pack of two, sharing what little they had and keeping each other warm through the harsh seasons. Rex had been his alarm clock, his entertainment, his reason to keep going when the weight of invisibility threatened to crush what remained of his spirit. Building the doghouse had been an act of hope, a statement that they deserved shelter and dignity even if the world disagreed. The day Rex didn't wake up, Everett had sat in the snow, holding his friend's still body, and wondering if this was how stories ended, with quiet surrender in forgotten places where no one would notice or care. But he'd built the doghouse anyway, as a monument to the love that had sustained him, and a reminder that he'd once been capable of caring for something beyond himself. Now the alley was his cathedral, the doghouse his altar of memory. The rhythm of the city provided his daily liturgy, the rumble of delivery trucks at dawn, the whispered conversations of early commuters, the distant hum of traffic building toward the crescendo of rush hour. He knew this symphony by heart, could predict its movements like a conductor who'd memorized every note. At precisely 6:47 a.m., Mrs. Chen would hurry past with clicking heels and a cell phone pressed to her ear. The construction workers started, their engines at 7:15, filling the air with diesel smoke and the promise of honest work. By 8 o'clock, the alley would fill with the sounds of a city fully awakened, and Everett would make himself smaller, quieter, more invisible. But these early morning hours belonged to him alone. This was when he allowed himself to remember who he'd been before the world decided he was nobody worth knowing. When he could hold his thermos like a communion cup and taste something besides the bitter knowledge of his own irrelevance. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the brick walls in shades of grey that promised another day of careful survival. Everett finished his coffee and screwed the cap back on his thermos, preparing for the daily ritual of becoming invisible again. But something was different this morning. A heaviness in the air that spoke of coming weather, the kind of atmospheric pressure that made old bones ache with prophecy. Storm clouds were gathering beyond the city's steel and glass horizon. Rain was coming, the kind that would drive people to hurry past his alley even faster than usual, heads down and focused on staying dry. It would be a good day for invisibility, but a hard day for those with nowhere to go when the sky opened. Up Everett tucked his thermos into the worn duffel bag that contained his entire life and settled back against the brick wall. Rex's doghouse sat silent beside him, waiting for a purpose it might never find again. The approaching storm felt like a promise of change, though Everett had learned not to trust such feelings. Change, in his experience, usually meant things getting worse. Still, he found himself listening more carefully to the city's morning song, as if somewhere in its familiar rhythm he might hear the first notes of something different, something that might matter, something that might remind him why he'd kept his thermos, kept the doghouse, kept himself alive through all the seasons of being forgotten. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. Everett pulled his jacket closer and prepared. to weather whatever was coming, just as he'd learned to weather everything else, with quiet dignity and the stubborn hope that tomorrow might be different from today. The rain started as Everett had predicted, with fat drops that struck the pavement, like exclamation points announcing the storm's arrival. By 2 o'clock, it had transformed into the kind of downpour that turns city streets into rivers and sends everyone scrambling for shelter. Everett huddled under the fire escape's metal grating, grateful for the small protection it offered, though water still found ways to drip through the gaps and soak his shoulders. He was dozing fitfully when he heard the splash of small feet in puddles. The sound was different from the hurried footsteps of adults trying to escape the rain. These were deliberate, almost playful, as if someone was walking through the storm by choice rather than necessity. "Excuse me, mister." The voice was high and clear, cutting through the drum of rain on metal. Everett opened his eyes to see a small figure standing at the mouth of the alley, backlit by the grey afternoon light. For a moment, he thought he might be dreaming. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him directly, let alone a child. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with dark skin glistening with rainwater and hair pulled back in 2 wet ponytails. Her clothes were soaked through, a pink t-shirt with a faded princess on the front, and jeans that were too big, rolled up at the cuffs. On her back, she carried a small backpack that had seen better days, its pink fabric torn in several places and held together with safety pins and determination. What struck Everett most was her posture, arms crossed over her chest, chin lifted in defiance of the rain and whatever else the world might throw at her. This was not a child who had given up, despite whatever circumstances had led her to his alley on this storm-soaked afternoon. "Can I sleep in your doghouse with you today?" The question hit Everett like a physical blow. He blinked several times, certain he'd misheard over the sound of the rain. But she stood there waiting, water dripping from her chin, eyes fixed on him with the kind of direct gaze that children possess before the world teaches them to look away from uncomfortable truths. "What?" Everett's voice came out rougher than he intended, rusty from disuse and shock. "Your doghouse," she said, pointing to the blue wooden structure beside him. "Can I sleep in it? I won't take up much room, and I'm not scared of dogs, even though I don't see one." Everett looked at the doghouse, then back at this impossible child who had materialized from the storm like something out of a fairy tale. If fairy tales included soaked 6-year-olds asking homeless men for shelter, the absurdity of the situation. Ward, with a growing sense of alarm. Where were her parents? Why was she alone in a rainstorm? "Little girl," he said carefully, "where's your mama, your daddy? You shouldn't be out here by yourself." Something flickered across her face, a shadow that seemed too old for such young features. "Mama's gone again," she said matter-of-factly, "and there ain't no daddy to speak of. The lady at the shelter said I had to wait my turn for a bed, but I don't like waiting, so I left." The words were delivered with the casual resignation of someone who'd learned not to expect much from adults or their promises. Everett felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. He knew that tone, had heard it in his own voice often enough, the sound of someone who'd stopped believing in rescue. "What's your name?" he asked, still trying to process the reality of this conversation. "Zora," she said. "Zora Washington. What's yours?" "Everett." He paused, then added, "Everett Cole. Nice to meet you, Mr. Everett Cole." She smiled then, a brilliant expression that transformed her whole face and made him realize how pretty she was underneath the rain and weariness. "So can I sleep in your doghouse? I promise I won't mess with your stuff or nothing. I just need somewhere dry for tonight." Everett's mind raced. Every instinct told him to send her away, to point her toward the police station or the shelter she'd left. He was in no position to help anyone, could barely take care of himself, let alone a child. The complications her presence would bring were staggering. Social services, questions he couldn't answer, attention he couldn't afford. But she was so small and the rain was so cold, and something in her eyes reminded him of Rex that first night, wounded but not broken, abandoned but not defeated. The doghouse is just big enough for you, he heard himself saying, and it's dry. But what about food? When's the last time you ate? Zora shrugged, a gesture that tried to be casual but couldn't quite hide the hunger underneath. This morning, I think. The shelter lady gave me some crackers. Everett reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a paper sack, his dinner purchased with change he'd collected over 3 days. A sandwich from Murphy's deli counter, an apple that was slightly soft, a bag of chips. He held it out to her. Here, eat this first. Zora's eyes widened, as if he'd offered her a feast. She took the bag with careful hands, cradling it like something precious. Thank you, she whispered, and the gratitude in her voice made Everett's throat tight. She settled cross-legged under the fire escape, protected from the worst of the rain, and ate with the focused intensity of genuine hunger. Everett watched her and tried to understand what was happening to him. For 3 years, he'd survived by keeping his world small, his needs simple, his connections non-existent. Now this child had stumbled into his carefully constructed invisibility and turned everything upside down with a single question. The doghouse is really nice, Zora said around a bite of sandwich. Did you build it for your dog? Yeah, Everett said softly. His name was Rex. He died last winter. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. I bet he was a good dog. He was the best. I always wanted a dog, Zora said wistfully, but Mama said we moved too much to keep pets, said it wasn't fair to them. She finished the sandwich and carefully folded the paper bag, smoothing out the wrinkles. Maybe someday when I'm a grown-up and got my own place. The simple hope in her voice broke something loose in Everett's chest. He found himself looking at her, really looking for the first time since she'd appeared. Under the rain-soaked exterior and 2 big clothes, he saw intelligence in her dark eyes, resilience in the set of her shoulders, and a kind of fundamental goodness that hadn't been crushed despite whatever life had thrown at her. Zora, he said carefully, how old are you? 6 3/4, she said with the precision children use when every month matters. I'll be 7 in December. 6 years old and navigating the world alone, making decisions about shelter and safety that no child should have to make. The reality of it settled over Everett like a weight he hadn't expected to carry again. The rain was showing no signs of stopping. If anything, it was getting heavier, turning the alley into a drumming orchestra of water and metal. Zora finished eating and looked expectantly at the doghouse, clearly ready to claim her promised shelter. It's going to be tight in there, Everett warned, and cold. I'm little, she said practically, and I got my backpack for a pillow. She crawled into the doghouse with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself comfortable anywhere. The space that had seemed adequate for Rex looked impossibly small with a child inside, but Zora settled in with satisfied sounds, pulling her torn backpack close and arranging herself like she was in the finest hotel. This is perfect, she announced, her voice muffled but content. Thank you, Mr. Everett Cole. Everett sat in the rain and watched the little feet sticking out of Rex's doghouse and wondered what in God's name he'd gotten himself into. Tomorrow would bring questions he couldn't answer, problems he couldn't solve, and complications that would shatter the fragile peace he'd built in this forgotten corner of the world. But tonight, for the first time in months, the doghouse served its original purpose, shelter for someone who needed it. And despite everything that should have terrified him about this situation, Everett felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. He felt needed. Morning arrived with the tentative light of a sun, uncertain whether yesterday's storm had truly passed. Everett had spent most of the night awake, listening to the small sounds coming from the doghouse, the rustle of movement, the occasional whispered word that might have been dream talk, the steady rhythm of breathing that told him Zora was sleeping. More peacefully than he'd managed in years, he'd positioned himself strategically between the doghouse and the alley's mouth, a guardian he hadn't asked to become, but couldn't bring himself to abandon. Every footstep on the street beyond made him tense. Every shadow that passed the opening made him wonder if this would be the moment when his temporary role as protector would be challenged. Around 6 a.m., Zora's head emerged from the doghouse like a turtle, testing the world beyond its shell. Her hair had dried in wild patterns overnight, and there was a crease across her cheek from where she'd slept against the wooden wall. But her eyes were bright and alert. "Good morning, Mr. Everett Cole," she said with the cheerful formality that seemed to be her trademark. "Morning, Zora. How'd you sleep?" She stretched elaborately, making satisfied sounds. "Better than most places. Your doghouse is cozy. Rex had good taste." The casual way she honored his lost companion caught Everett off guard. Most people, when they learned about Rex, either pitied him for the loss or dismissed it as unimportant. Just a homeless man's dog, after all. But Zora spoke of Rex as if he'd been family, which Everett realized was exactly what he had been. "You hungry?" Everett asked, though he wasn't sure what he could offer. His resources were stretched thin on the best of days, and adding a child's appetite to his calculations was unfamiliar math. "I could eat," Zora said diplomatically, but Everett heard the hope underneath her casual tone. Before he could figure out how to stretch his meager supplies, a voice called from the alley's entrance. "Well, what do we have here?" They both turned to see a woman in her late 60s standing at the mouth of the alley, holding a steaming coffee cup and regarding them with curious but not unkind eyes. She was Hispanic, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and clothing that spoke of modest comfort. Clean jeans, a cardigan that had seen better days but was carefully maintained, shoes that were practical rather than fashionable. Elena Rodriguez had been passing through this alley for 3 months now, ever since she'd discovered it provided a quieter route to the library where she volunteered. She'd noticed Everett, of course, had even nodded to him a few times when their eyes met, but had never stopped to talk. People chose homelessness for different reasons, she'd learned, and sometimes the kindest thing was to respect their privacy. But a child changed everything. "Hello," she said gently, addressing both of them but focusing on Zora. "I'm Elena. I live a few blocks from here." "I'm Zora, and this is Mr. Everett Cole," Zora replied with her characteristic directness. "I slept in his doghouse last night because it was raining." Elena's eyes moved from the child to Everett, and he saw her processing the situation with the quick assessment of someone who dealt with life's complications before. There was no judgment in her gaze, only concern and a growing understanding that she'd stumbled into something that required careful handling. "That was smart of you to get out of the rain," Elena said to Zora, "but I bet you're hungry this morning, and Mr. Cole probably is too." She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, extending it toward Everett. "Murphy's opens in an hour. Why don't you get some breakfast for both of you?" Everett stared at the money as if it were a snake. In 3 years of homelessness, he'd learned to read the motivations behind charity. Some people gave to feel better about themselves, others gave out of genuine kindness, and still others gave as a way to maintain distance, paying someone to go away and stop making them uncomfortable. Elena's offer felt different. It wasn't pity or dismissal, but something more like recognition. One adult acknowledging another's responsibility for a child's welfare, regardless of circumstances. "I can't," Everett started, but Elena held up a hand. "I'm not giving it to you," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm giving it to her." She crouched down to Zora's eye level. "Mija, you make sure Mr. Cole gets himself something to eat too, okay? A man can't take proper care of a little girl if he's hungry himself." Zora took the 20 with solemn ceremony, as if Elena had just appointed her treasurer of something important. "I'll make sure he eats," she promised. "He gave me his dinner last night, so now it's my turn to share." Elena's eyes softened as she looked at this small girl who understood reciprocity and responsibility despite her age and circumstances. She straightened and addressed Everett directly. "I'm a retired librarian," she said. "Spent 40 years helping people find what they needed, whether that was books or resources or just someone to listen. I'm Elena Rodriguez, and I walk through." This alley every Tuesday and Thursday on my way to volunteer at the downtown branch. It was an introduction, and an offer rolled into one. She was telling him who she was, establishing her routine, and making it clear that she'd be around if they needed help, but without making it sound like interference. "Thank you," Everett said simply. The words felt rusty in his mouth. It had been so long since someone had shown him kindness without expecting something in return. "The pleasure's mine," Elena replied. She looked at Zora again. "You know, Mija, the library has a wonderful children's section. Lots of books about dogs, if you're interested." Zora's face lit up. "Really? Books about dogs?" "All kinds. Big dogs, little dogs, dogs who have adventures. Maybe I could show you. Sometime, if Mr. Cole thinks it's a good idea." The casual way Elena included Everett in the decision-making process didn't escape his notice. She could have simply invited Zora and left him out of the equation entirely. Instead, she was acknowledging his role as the child's current guardian, treating him with the respect due to someone responsible for a child's welfare. It was a small thing, but it made Everett stand a little straighter. "I think Zora would like that," he said carefully. "She seems like a smart girl who'd appreciate books." "I love books," Zora confirmed. "Mama used to read to me sometimes, when she wasn't too tired." Elena nodded, filing away this information about Zora's mother without comment. "Well then, it's settled. But first, breakfast. Growing girls need proper food." She checked her watch, a practical piece that looked like it had served her well for many years. "I have to get to the library, but I'll be back through here around lunchtime. Maybe we can all talk more then." As she turned to leave, Eleanor paused and looked back at Everett. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there's something about you that seems familiar. I'm good with faces. Comes from all those years helping library patrons. I'll remember eventually." After she'd gone, Everett and Zora sat in the morning quiet, both processing the encounter with their unexpected benefactor. The $20 bill felt warm in Zora's small hand, like a physical manifestation of kindness that neither of them had expected to find. "She's nice," Zora said eventually. "And she didn't look at you the way most people do." "What way is that?" "Like, you're not really there," Zora said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Like you're just part of the scenery, not a real person." Everett felt something twist in his chest. He'd grown so accustomed to invisibility that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as human. Eleanor had looked directly at him when she spoke, had treated him as Zora's guardian rather than an obstacle to be worked around. "Come on," he said, getting to his feet and extending a hand to help Zora up. "Let's go get some breakfast, and maybe we can figure out what we're going to do next." As they walked toward Murphy's store, Zora's small hand found his, and Everett realized that somewhere in the space of one night and one morning, everything in his carefully constructed world had shifted. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was someone a child depended on. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in years, it made him feel like he might actually matter again. They were sharing a stack of pancakes at one of Murphy's outdoor tables when the woman in the business suit found them. Sarah Chen had been looking for Zora Washington since dawn, following leads from the overnight shelter and checking the usual places where runaway children tried to disappear. She was 34, efficient, and had developed the kind of professional radar that came from 5 years working child services in an underfunded system that asked too much of everyone involved. What she found was not what she'd expected. Instead of a frightened child hiding alone or being taken advantage of by predators, she discovered a 6-year-old girl sitting at a wobbly plastic table, carefully cutting pancakes into precise squares, while carrying on an animated conversation with a homeless man who listened to her with the kind of attention most adults reserved for their supervisors. "Are you Zora Washington?" Sarah asked, approaching their table with the careful neutrality she'd learned to maintain in situations that might require quick intervention. Zora looked up from her breakfast, syrup on her chin and wariness creeping into her eyes. Depends on who's asking. Sarah couldn't help but smile at the child's caution. Smart kid, exactly what she'd expect from someone who'd learned to navigate the system's failures. She pulled out her identification and showed it to both Zora and Everett. I'm Sarah Chen. I'm a social worker with the county, and I've been looking for you since the shelter reported you missing yesterday evening. Everett tensed, his protective instincts flaring. This was what he'd been dreading. The moment when official intervention would sweep Zora away from the small safety they'd created. Together, but Zora surprised him by reaching over and taking his hand. I'm not missing, she said calmly. I'm right here with Mr. Everett Cole. He took care of me when I didn't have anywhere to go. Sarah's trained eye took in the scene. The child's clean face and neat appearance despite yesterday's circumstances, the careful way the man was monitoring her eating, the obvious bond that had formed between them. This wasn't the exploitation scenario she'd feared. It was something more complicated and potentially more hopeful. Mr. Cole, she said, extending her hand to Everett. I'm glad to meet you, and I'm grateful that you helped Zora when she needed it. Everett shook her hand cautiously, unsure where this conversation was heading, but impressed by her straightforward approach. He'd expected accusations, demands, immediate removal of Zora from his care. Instead, Sarah Chen was treating him like someone who'd done something right. Can we talk? Sarah asked, pulling up a third chair without waiting for permission. It was a practiced move, establishing herself as part of the conversation rather than an outside authority imposing judgment. Zora told me her mother is missing again, Everett said carefully. How long has this been going on? Sarah glanced at Zora, who was listening with the intense focus children develop when adults discuss their lives. There was no point in pretending the child wasn't aware of her own situation. Zora's been in and out of the system for 2 years, Sarah said honestly. Her mother struggles with addiction and mental health issues. When she's stable, she can provide good care. When she's not, she gestured at the current situation. Zora ends up in emergency placement until we can locate her mother or find a more permanent solution. What kind of permanent solution? Zora asked, her small voice carrying the weight of experience with promises that fell through. Sarah's expression softened as she looked at the child. Well, ideally we'd find you a family who could take care of you long term, people who'd make sure you had a safe place to sleep, regular meals, help with school, all the things every child deserves. But that hasn't happened yet, Zora observed with the blunt realism of someone who'd learned not to count on ideal outcomes. No, Mika, it hasn't, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. Everett found himself studying Sarah Chen as she talked with Zora. She was direct without being harsh, honest without destroying hope, and she treated Zora as someone capable of understanding her own situation. Most importantly, she didn't seem to be in any hurry to separate them. What happens now? Everett asked. Sarah leaned back in her chair, clearly thinking through options that weren't outlined in any manual. Well, officially, I need to take Zora back into protective custody while we continue looking for appropriate placement. Zora's hand tightened on Everett's, and he felt her small body tense beside him. But, Sarah continued, I've been doing this job long enough to recognize when something unusual is working. Zora looks better cared for this morning than she has after most of her official placements. She turned to address Everett directly. I don't know your story, Mr. Cole, but I can see that you've been taking care of this child. The question is, would you be willing to continue doing so while we work out the legal details? Everett felt the world tilt beneath him. I'm homeless, he said, as if Sarah hadn't noticed. I live in an alley. I can barely take care of myself, let alone you. He fed her, Sarah interrupted. You made sure she had shelter. You're sitting here making sure she finishes her breakfast. Those are the basics of childcare, Mr. Cole, and a lot of people with houses and steady jobs don't manage them as well as you did last night. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through something, then showed them a photo of a small apartment building There's emergency housing available through a program we work with. Basic apartment, furnished, utilities included. It's designed for situations exactly like this, when we need to keep a child safe while working through complicated family situations. Zora was staring at the photo with barely concealed hope. A real apartment, with walls and a kitchen? Real. Walls, real kitchen, real bed for you, Sarah confirmed. The question is whether Mr. Cole would be willing to be your temporary guardian while we try to find your mother and figure out what's best for everyone. Everett looked at Zora, then at Sarah, then back at Zora. The little girl was watching him with an expression that held so much hope and trust, it made his chest tight. She was asking him to be responsible for her safety, her welfare, her future, and she was 6 years old, which meant she had no idea what she was asking. But he did. He knew exactly what it meant to be trusted with someone's life, to have someone depend on you completely, to be the difference between safety and disaster for another human being. He'd carried that responsibility once before, in a classroom full of children who'd looked at him with similar trust. "I don't know anything about raising kids," he said quietly. "Not really. I was a teacher. But that's different from this. You were a teacher." Sarah's eyebrows rose with interest. "What grade? What subject?" "Elementary music education. 4th grade, mostly." The words felt strange after so many years of not saying them aloud. Sarah and Zora exchanged glances, and Everett realized they were both smiling. "Mr. Cole," Sarah said gently, "elementary teachers know more about taking care of children than most parents do when they start. You've got training and experience most people don't have." "That was a long time ago," Everett said. "I'm not that person anymore." Zora's small hand found his again. "You're still that person," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "You're just having a hard time right now. But you took care of me, and you were a teacher, and teachers are supposed to help kids learn things." Sarah was watching this exchange with professional interest and personal amazement. In 5 years of child services work, she'd seen plenty of emergency placements that looked perfect on paper but fell apart under pressure. She'd also seen unconventional arrangements that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. This felt like the latter. "The program provides support," she said to Everett. "Social worker visits, help with getting Zora enrolled in school, assistance navigating the system. You wouldn't be doing this alone." Everett was quiet for a long moment, staring at the remains of their shared breakfast. The pancakes had gone cold while they talked, but Zora had eaten most of hers, more food than she'd probably had in days. That simple fact felt like evidence of something, though he wasn't sure what. "What if I mess this up?" he asked finally. "What if I'm not good enough at this?" "What if you are?" Zora countered, tilting her head to study his face. "What if you're exactly good enough?" Sarah felt something shift in her chest as she watched this exchange. After years of dealing with adults who wanted to take children for the wrong reasons, or who wouldn't take them for reasons that seemed right but felt selfish, she was witnessing something rare. A man who was afraid he wasn't good enough to help a child, and a child who was convinced he was. "Mr. Cole," Sarah said gently, "I've placed children with people who had every advantage. Stable jobs, nice homes, college educations, references from pillars of the community. Some of those placements worked out beautifully. Others fell apart because the adults weren't really ready to put a child's needs first." She gestured at the small space between Everett and Zora, where their hands remained linked across the plastic table. "What I see here is a man who gave his dinner to a hungry child and spent the night in the rain making sure she was safe. That tells me more about your character than any background check could." Everett looked at Zora, who was watching him with patient hope, as if she'd learned to wait for adults to make up their minds about her future, but hadn't given up, believing that sometimes they made the right choice. "Okay," he said quietly. "Yes, I'll try." Zora's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Really? We get to stay together?" "We get to try staying together," Everett corrected. but he was smiling too. We'll see how it goes. Zora pulled out paperwork that she'd been carrying, just in case this conversation went better than she'd expected. There are forms to fill out, background checks to process, apartment inspections to schedule, but I can expedite most of it. If you're both sure about this, we could have you moved in by the weekend. The weekend, 3 days away. Everett tried to imagine sleeping in a real bed, cooking meals in a real kitchen, helping Zora with homework at a real table. After 3 years of surviving day by day, the prospect of planning 3 days ahead felt both thrilling and terrifying. "What about my stuff?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the alley where his life was stored in a duffel bag and a wooden doghouse. "Bring everything," Sarah said practically, "especially the doghouse. Something tells me it means a lot to both of you." Zora nodded emphatically. "Rex would want to come too. Even if he's not here anymore, his house should stay with us." As Sarah began explaining the paperwork process, Everett found himself looking around Murphy's outdoor seating area with new eyes. Yesterday morning, he'd been invisible, existing on the margins of other people's lives. Now, he was signing documents that would make him legally responsible for another human being. The magnitude of the change should have overwhelmed him. Instead, it felt like something he'd been waiting for without knowing it. A chance to matter again, to use whatever was left of himself for something important. When Elena Rodriguez appeared at their table 20 minutes later, carrying her afternoon coffee and wondering how Zora's breakfast had gone, she found 3 people bent over official forms, planning a future together that none of them could have imagined the day before. "Well," Elena said, settling into the 4th chair as if she'd been expected all along, "this looks promising." The apartment inspection was scheduled for Thursday morning, which gave Everett and Zora 2 more nights in the alley. They spent Wednesday evening organizing his few possessions and talking about what their new life might look like, while Elena sat with them on an overturned crate, offering practical advice about child-rearing that she'd gleaned from 40 years of observing families. At the library, it was during one of these conversations that Zora heard Everett humming. He didn't realize he was doing it at first. It was just something that happened when he felt content, a habit from his teaching days when he'd hum scales while grading papers or organizing sheet music. The melody was simple, something he'd taught his 4th graders years ago, but it floated through the evening air like a half-remembered prayer. "That's pretty," Zora said, pausing in her careful inventory of her backpack contents. "What song is that?" Everett stopped mid-hum, suddenly self-conscious. "Just something I used to teach. It's not important." "Sing it," Zora said with the direct command style that had become familiar. "With words, I mean." "Oh, I don't really sing anymore," Everett said. But something in Zora's expectant expression made him reconsider. When had he stopped singing? When had music, the thing that had once been as natural to him as breathing, become something he no longer did? Elena, who had been listening with growing interest, leaned forward. "You know, I think I recognize that melody. Something about it seems familiar." Everett looked from one expectant face to the other and realized he was trapped by kindness. They weren't asking him to perform. They were asking him to share something of himself, the part that had existed before. Homelessness had stripped away most of what he'd thought defined him. "It's called Little Light," he said quietly. "I wrote it for my students, to help them remember that everyone has something special to offer the world." "You wrote it?" Zora's eyes widened. "Like you made up the whole song?" "The melody and the words, yeah. It wasn't anything fancy, just something to help kids feel good about themselves." Elena was studying his face with renewed intensity, and Everett saw the moment when recognition finally clicked into place. Her reading glasses, worn on a chain around her neck, caught the late afternoon light as she leaned closer. "Everett Cole," she said slowly. "Elementary music education. You taught at Riverside Elementary." Everett's stomach dropped. He'd grown accustomed to anonymity, to being just another homeless man whose past didn't matter. The thought of Elena, Knowing who he'd been, and by extension what he'd lost, made him want to retreat into the safety of invisibility. "That was a long time ago," he said carefully. "My neighbor's daughter was in your class," Elena continued, her voice warming with memory. "Maria Santos. She came home every day singing your songs, talking about Mr. Cole and his magic pitch pipe." She gestured to the small silver instrument hanging from a cord around his neck, the one thing from his teaching days he'd never been able to throw away. Zora noticed the pitch pipe for the first time, reaching out to touch it gently. "What's a pitch pipe?" Instead of answering, Everett found himself pulling the instrument to his lips and blowing a soft, clear note. The sound hung in the air between them, pure and true, carrying with it the ghost of classroom sing-alongs and children's voices learning to find their own pitch. "It helps people sing in tune," he explained, demonstrating with a few more notes. "Every voice is different, but when we all start from the same place, we can make harmony together." Zora was enchanted. "Show me how." And before he quite realized what was happening, Everett was teaching again. He blew a gentle G and had Zora match the pitch with her voice, surprisingly clear and true for someone so young. Then he demonstrated how different notes could work together, humming harmony while she held the melody line of "Little Light." Eleanor watched with growing amazement as the homeless man she'd known for months transformed before her eyes. His posture straightened, his voice gained confidence, and his face lit up with the kind of joy that only comes from doing what you were meant to do. This was who he'd been before, whatever tragedy had brought him to the alley. A teacher who made music accessible to children, who helped them find their voices both literally and figuratively. "You're really good at this," Zora said after they'd worked through the simple song together. "Did you teach lots of kids to sing?" "Hundreds," Everett admitted, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. "Every year for 15 years. Some of them couldn't carry a tune in a bucket when they started, but by the end of the year they were making music together." "What happened?" Elena asked gently. "How did you end up?" She gestured around the alley, tactful enough not to say homeless in front of Zora. Everett was quiet for a long moment, his fingers turning the pitch pipe over and over in his hands. It was a story he'd never told anyone, not even Rex during their long conversations in the dark. But something about the evening light and these two women, one old enough to understand life's complications, one young enough to believe in fresh starts, made the words feel possible. "Someone made accusations," he said finally, "about inappropriate behavior with students. It wasn't true, I was cleared completely, but by the time the investigation was over, the damage was done. Parents didn't want their children in my classroom. The school district couldn't find a position for me. Other districts wouldn't hire me because of the rumors." Elena's expression hardened with understanding. She'd seen good people destroyed by whisper campaigns, watched careers and lives unravel because someone had decided to weaponize suspicion against an innocent person. "That's terrible," Zora said, with the straightforward moral clarity of childhood. "People shouldn't lie about teachers. Teachers are supposed to help kids." "Sometimes people do lie," Everett said sadly, "and sometimes the lie spreads faster than the truth can catch up." "But you're still a teacher," Zora insisted. "You just taught me to sing, and you explained about the pitch pipe, and you made sure I ate breakfast. That's what teachers do." Elena felt something shift in her chest as she watched Everett absorb this simple reframing from a 6-year-old. Zora was right, of course. Being a teacher wasn't just a job title, it was a way of being in the world. The man sitting beside them had lost his classroom and his income, but he hadn't lost his fundamental nature as someone who helped others learn and grow. "Maria Santos," Elena said suddenly, "my neighbor's daughter. She's 24 now, married, has a little boy of her own. But she still talks about your class, about how you made her feel like she could sing even though she was shy." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. "I think you should know something, Everett. You think your teaching career was destroyed. but some of your students never forgot what you gave them." As the sun began to set behind the city's skyline, painting the alley walls in shades of gold and amber, Elena began telling stories about the children Everett had taught, where they were now, what they remembered, how his influence had shaped them in ways he'd never known. With each story, Everett felt pieces of his former self returning, the man who'd believed every child deserved to be heard, who'd spent his own money on instruments for students who couldn't afford them, who'd stayed after school to work with kids who needed extra help finding their voices. That man wasn't gone. He'd just been buried under years of survival and shame and the grinding exhaustion of having no place in the world. But he was still there, and Zora's simple faith in him was calling him back to the surface. When Sarah Chen arrived the next morning for the apartment inspection, she found something she hadn't expected. 3 people sitting in comfortable companionship in an alley, singing together in 3-part harmony as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The song they were singing was called "Little Light," and it was about remembering that everyone has something special to offer, no matter how dark things might seem. Sarah stood at the mouth of the alley and listened, and understood that what she was witnessing wasn't just an emergency placement coming together, it was a family discovering itself through the simple act of making music in a forgotten corner of the city. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, of a brick building that had seen better decades, but maintained a kind of stubborn dignity. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened onto a living area with windows that actually let in light. To Zora, who pressed her face against the glass to see the street below, it might as well have been a palace. "This is really ours," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make it disappear. "For as long as you need it," Sarah confirmed, handing Everett a set of keys that felt impossibly heavy in his palm. "The program covers rent and utilities for up to 6 months while we work through the legal arrangements." Eleanor moved through the space with the practical eye of someone who'd helped many people settle into new homes. "You'll need bedding, basic kitchen supplies, some clothes for Zora." She was making mental lists, already planning the logistics of turning 4 walls into a home, but it was the hand-drawn map taped to Zora's bedroom wall that stopped all conversation. The previous tenant's child had left it behind, a crayon masterpiece that showed the neighborhood from a 6-year-old's perspective. The apartment building was rendered in careful purple, surrounded by important landmarks. The corner store, labeled food, the library, with books drawn floating around it like confetti, the school, complete with a playground that took up half the block, and most prominently, a small green space labeled "The Alley Where I Met My Friend." Zora stared at the map with wonder. "Look, it's like she knew we were coming. She drew our alley." Everett studied the child's artwork and felt something settle in his chest. This unknown little girl had seen the neighborhood as a place of connections and possibilities, not just buildings and streets. She'd understood that even alleys could be important if the right things happened there. "We should add to it," Zora announced with sudden inspiration. "Draw in the new things we find." Over the next 3 days, as they moved their few possessions from the alley to the apartment, that map became their planning document. Elena helped them identify the closest grocery store, drawn in as Elena's Food Place in Zora's careful printing, and Sarah showed them where the elementary school was located, enhanced with additional playground equipment in bright marker. But the transition wasn't without its complications. On their second night in the apartment, Zora woke up crying from a nightmare about being taken away again. She'd dreamed that she'd gotten too comfortable, too happy, and the adults had decided she didn't deserve it after all. Everett found her huddled in her new bed, clutching the stuffed elephant that Sarah had brought as a housewarming gift. "What if this is too good?" she whispered when he sat on the edge of her bed. "What if I mess it up somehow?" Everett looked at this small girl who'd learned to fear happiness because it had been taken from her too many times before. He understood that. Fear had lived with it himself for years, afraid to hope for anything better because disappointment hurt less when you expected it. "You know what I think?" he said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "I think you deserve good things. I think you deserve to feel safe and cared for, and anyone who made you feel otherwise was wrong. But what if Mama comes back and she's angry that I'm not waiting for her?" It was the first time Zora had directly addressed the central complication of their situation. Her mother was out there somewhere, struggling with demons Zora couldn't understand or fix, and her absence was both abandonment and relief, a contradiction too complex for a 6-year-old to resolve. Everett chose his words carefully. "Your mama loves you, even when she can't take care of you the way you need. And when she's ready to be the parent you deserve, we'll figure out how to make that work. But right now, today, your job is just to be a little girl who's safe and loved. Do you love me?" The question was whispered, as if she was afraid of the answer. "Yeah," Everett said, surprised by how easily the word came. "Yeah, I do." Zora curled up against his side, and they sat together in the darkness of her new bedroom, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood settling into sleep. Through the window, they could see the lights of other apartments where other families were going through their own evening routines, and for the first time in years, Everett felt like he belonged to that community of people who had places to go home to. The crisis came on Thursday afternoon. Everett was at the grocery store with Eleanor, learning to shop for a family of 2 instead of just himself, when Sarah arrived at the apartment with news that changed everything. Zora was at the kitchen table, working on a coloring book, when Sarah knocked, her expression more serious than usual. "We found your mother," Sarah said without preamble. "She's in jail in Baltimore, arrested 3 days ago on drug charges. She's asking to see you." Zora's crayon stopped moving. "Mama's in jail?" "Yes, Mija, but she's safe, and she's getting help. The question is, do you want to visit her?" For a long moment, Zora said nothing. Then she set down her crayon and looked at Sarah with eyes that seemed older than her 6 years. "If I see Mama, does that mean I have to go with her? When she gets out, I mean." Sarah sat down at the table, bringing herself to Zora's eye level. "Not necessarily. Your mother has some serious issues to work through before she can provide proper care for you. The court will want to see her complete treatment and maintain stability for an extended period." "How long is extended?" "Probably at least a year, maybe more." Zora absorbed this information with the resignation of someone who'd learned not to count on adult timelines. "And Mr. Everett Cole, can he keep taking care of me during that time?" "If he wants to, and if the court approves the arrangement, yes." When Everett and Elena returned with groceries 20 minutes later, they found Zora and Sarah engaged in serious conversation about visits, legal procedures, and the complicated emotions that came with loving someone who couldn't love you back in healthy ways. Everett listened to the update about Zora's mother and felt a familiar twist of anxiety in his stomach. Just as he'd started to believe in the possibility of their makeshift family, reality was intruding with complications that could unravel everything they'd built. "What do you think?" he asked Zora. "Do you want to see your mama?" Zora was quiet. For a long time, her small fingers tracing patterns on the kitchen table. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I want to see her so she knows I'm okay," she said, "but I want to come home to you after. This is home now, right? With you and Elena and the apartment and the map on my wall." Everett felt something break open in his chest. Not the painful break of loss, but the expansive break of a heart-making room for more love than it thought it could hold. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is home." Elena, who had been listening to this exchange while unpacking groceries, paused with a box of cereal in her hands. She looked at these 2 people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances and built something real out of nothing but mutual need and growing affection. "Family isn't always about blood," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most." As evening settled over their third-floor apartment, Everett helped Zora add new details to the neighborhood map on her bedroom wall. They drew in their grocery store, with Elena's smiling face in the window, the social services building where Sarah worked, decorated with helping hands, and most importantly, a small heart over the apartment building with "Home" written in careful letters beneath it. Outside, the city continued its daily symphony of life and movement. But inside apartment 3B, three people who'd started as strangers were learning what it meant to be a family, not through genetics or legal documents, but through the simple choice to keep showing up for each other, day after day, regardless of what complications the world might throw at them. The doghouse sat in the corner of Zora's room, no longer a shelter from the storm, but a reminder of how far they'd traveled from that first rainy night when a little girl had asked if she could sleep somewhere safe, and a broken man had found the courage to say yes. Elena found the newspaper, clipping by accident. She was helping Everett organize his few possessions in his new bedroom when the yellowed piece of paper fluttered from between the pages of his battered copy of Music Education for Elementary Students. The headline was still clearly visible despite the age. Local teacher wins state recognition for innovation in music education. The photograph showed a younger Everett Cole standing in front of a classroom full of beaming children, holding a plaque that proclaimed him Elementary Music Educator of the Year. His smile in the picture was radiant, unguarded, full of the joy that comes from doing work that matters. Elena stared at the clipping for a long moment before calling to Everett, who was in the kitchen helping Zora organize their new dishes. "Everett," she said carefully, "could you come here for a moment?" He appeared in the doorway, tea towel still in his hands, and froze when he saw what Elena was holding. The blood drained from his face so quickly that Elena reached out to steady him. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry. It just fell out of your book." Everett sat heavily on the edge of his new bed, staring at the newspaper clipping as if it were evidence of a crime. In many ways, that's exactly what it felt like. Proof of who he'd been before the world decided he was nobody worth knowing. "Elementary Music Educator of the Year," Elena read softly. "Everett Cole's innovative teaching methods and dedication to his students have earned him statewide recognition." She looked up at him with growing understanding. "This wasn't just a job for you, was it? This was your calling." "Was," Everett emphasized bitterly. Past tense. Elena sat beside him, still holding the clipping. "What really happened, Everett? I mean the real story, not just the abbreviated version you gave us before." For a moment it seemed like he might not answer. Then Zora appeared in the doorway, drawn by the serious tone of their conversation. "What's wrong?" she asked with the immediate alertness of a child who'd learned to monitor adult emotions for signs of danger. "Nothing's wrong, Mija," Elena said gently. "We're just talking about Mr. Cole's teaching days." Zora joined them on the bed, looking at the newspaper clipping with interest. "You look happy in this picture," she observed. "Really, really happy." "I was," Everett admitted. "That was taken 3 months before everything fell apart. And then, perhaps because the afternoon light in his new bedroom felt safe, or because these two people had already seen him at his lowest point and stayed anyway, Everett began to tell the real story. It started with Marcus Williams, a 4th grader who struggled academically but had a beautiful singing voice. Everett had worked with Marcus after school, helping him build confidence through music, connecting with his grandmother, who was raising him alone. The extra attention paid off. Marcus's grades improved, his behavior problems disappeared, and he began to flourish. But Marcus's father, absent for most of the boy's life, suddenly reappeared with demands for custody and resentment toward anyone who'd filled the parental role in his absence. When the grandmother refused to give up custody, the father looked for ways to strike back at the people he blamed for his son's loyalty to others. "He accused me of inappropriate behavior with Marcus," Everett said, his voice flat with old pain. Said I was spending too much one-on-one time with his son, implied that a male teacher who cared that much about children must have ulterior motives. Elena's expression darkened with understanding. She'd seen this before. Good people destroyed by the weaponization of suspicion, careers ended by accusations that played on society's worst fears. The investigation took 4 months, Everett continued. 4 months of being suspended with pay while every interaction I'd ever had with students was scrutinized. 4 months of colleagues avoiding me, parents pulling their children from my program, news reporters camping outside my apartment. But you were cleared, Zora said, with the confidence of someone who knew him well enough to be certain of his character. Completely exonerated, Everett confirmed. The investigators found no evidence of wrongdoing because there was none. Marcus himself testified that I'd never done anything inappropriate, that I'd just helped him learn to sing and feel good about himself. So what happened then? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew. Nothing. Everett's laugh was bitter. That's the insidious thing about false accusations. Proving your innocence doesn't undo the damage. Parents still worried. Administrators still hesitated. Other school districts still saw my name as a liability. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where they were trying to build a new life. I applied for dozens of positions, made it to final interviews several times, but someone always asked about that situation at my previous school. Even when I explained what really happened, I could see the doubt in their eyes. Elena felt a familiar rage building in her chest, the same anger she'd felt watching other innocent people consumed by rumor and innuendo. So you gave up teaching. Teaching gave up on me first, Everett replied. After 2 years of unemployment, I couldn't make my rent anymore. Lost my apartment, then my car, then any hope of getting back into education. Who's going to hire a homeless teacher? Zora was staring at the newspaper clipping with new understanding. That's why you were in the alley, not because you did anything wrong, but because someone lied about you. People believe what they want to believe, Everett said sadly, and they want to believe that bad things happen to people who deserve them. It's easier than admitting that sometimes good people just get unlucky. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Her librarian's mind processing this information and connecting it to resources and possibilities that might not have occurred to Everett. Have you ever tried to clear your name officially? She asked. Not just the criminal investigation, but publicly, setting the record straight? What would be the point? It's been years. The people who matter have moved on to other concerns. The people who matter, Elena said firmly, are the children who could benefit from having you as their teacher. And there are ways to rehabilitate a reputation, especially when the original accusations were proven false. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. I know people in the education system, administrators who care more about qualifications than gossip. And I know journalists who specialize in stories about people overcoming adversity. Elena, no, listen to me. She turned to face him directly. You've spent years thinking your career was over because some bitter man decided to destroy you, rather than deal with his own failures as a father. But you're still a teacher, Everett. You've been teaching Zora about music, about kindness, about how to build a life from nothing. Those are the skills the world needs. Zora nodded emphatically. You taught me to sing, and you taught me that some adults can be trusted, and you taught me what home feels like. That's important teaching. Everett looked at these two people who believed in him more than he'd believed in himself for years, and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of hope. The idea that maybe his story wasn't over, that maybe the worst thing that had ever happened to him didn't have to be the last word on who he was. Even if I could clear my name, he said carefully, even if I could teach again, I'm not the same person I was before. I don't know if I have the energy or optimism to be what those kids need. Zora slipped off the bed and walked to where he stood by the window. She took his hand and looked up at him with absolute seriousness. "You have exactly the energy I needed," she said simply. "And if you helped me, you can help other kids too. You just have to remember how." Elena joined them at the window, the three of them looking out at the neighborhood that was becoming home. "What if we started small?" she suggested. "What if I asked around about tutoring opportunities? Music lessons for kids who can't afford proper instruction? Nothing official at first, just a way to get you back in the water." Everett was quiet for a long time, the newspaper clipping still clutched in his hand. The photograph showed a man who'd believed in his own worth, who'd known beyond doubt that he had something valuable to offer the world. That man felt like a stranger now, but looking at Zora's trusting face and Elena's determined expression, he could almost remember what it felt like to be him. "Okay," he said finally. "Small steps. We'll see what happens." Elena smiled and pulled them both into an impulsive hug. "What happens is, we remind the world who you really are. And then we let you get back to the work you were born to do." As evening settled over their apartment, the three of them sat around the kitchen table with Elena's laptop, researching programs for displaced educators and organizations that helped people rebuild their careers after false accusations. It was the first time in years that Everett had allowed himself to think about the future as something other than simple survival. The newspaper clipping lay beside the computer, a reminder that he'd once been someone worth celebrating. With Zora's hand in his and Elena's unwavering support, he began to believe that maybe, somehow, he could be that person again. The legal paperwork arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt too ordinary for such momentous news. Sarah Chen spread the documents across their kitchen table while Zora ate cereal, and Everett tried to process the reality of what she was telling them. The state had fast-tracked his background check. His references from former colleagues had been overwhelmingly positive, and most importantly, the court had approved his application to become Zora's temporary guardian with a path toward permanent custody. "This is really happening," he said, staring at the official seal that made their makeshift family legitimate in the eyes of the law. "There's more," Sarah said, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine excitement. "Elena's journalist friend published that article about your case last week. 3 school districts have already called asking about your availability for substitute teaching positions." Everett felt the familiar flutter of panic, mixed with hope that had become his constant companion since they'd started this process. Teaching again. The possibility both thrilled and terrified him. What if he'd lost his touch? What if the years of survival had worn away whatever gift he'd once possessed for connecting with children? "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "Nobody's ever ready for the big changes," Elena said from the kitchen counter where she was packing lunch for Zora's first day at her new school. "But ready or not, life keeps moving forward." The apartment search had taken 3 weeks. The emergency housing was temporary, and they needed something more permanent, a real home where Zora could put down roots and Everett could rebuild his life from a foundation of stability rather than mere survival. Eleanor had been instrumental in the process, using her network of contacts to find them a 2-bedroom place 6 blocks away that was within their budget and close to good schools. The landlord, Mrs. Patterson, was a retired teacher herself who'd been moved by Everett's story and was willing to work with them on the deposit. "It has a small garden behind it," Elena had told them excitedly. "Perfect for growing herbs and maybe some vegetables. Zora could learn to garden." Now, looking at the lease agreement among the legal documents on their table, Everett tried to imagine himself as someone who signed leases, who made plans beyond next week, who could promise to pay rent for a full year because he believed he'd still be employable 12 months from now. The transformation felt too rapid, too dramatic. 3 months ago, he'd been invisible, existing day to day with no expectations beyond basic survival. Now he was signing guardianship papers and lease agreements, accepting substitute teaching positions, and planning Zora's enrollment in second grade. "What if I mess this up?" he asked Sarah, voicing the fear that kept him awake at night. What if I'm not cut out for this kind of responsibility? Sarah looked up from organizing the paperwork, her expression serious but kind. Everett, in 5 years of child services work, I've placed children with people who had perfect backgrounds, stable jobs, and nice homes. Some of those placements failed because the adults weren't really committed to putting a child's needs first. She gestured at Zora, who was carefully reading the back of the cereal box as if it contained vital information. Look at her, really look. She's gained 8 pounds since she's been with you. She sleeps through the night now. She laughs every day. She's planning her future instead of just surviving her present. Those are just the basics, Everett protested. Any decent adult should be able to. Any decent adult should, but many don't, Sarah interrupted. You've given her stability, affection, and most importantly, you've made her feel valued. That's not basic parenting, Everett. That's exceptional parenting. Elena turned from the counter with Zora's packed lunch in her hands. She's right. No. I've watched hundreds of families come through the library over the years. I can tell the difference between children who are just cared for and children who are truly loved. Zora looked up from her cereal box, sensing that the conversation was about her. Are you worried about me starting school? She asked Everett, with the perceptiveness that continued to amaze him. A little, he admitted. It's a big change for both of us. Will you be there when I get home? Every day. Will we still live together in our new apartment? As long as you want to. Will you still help me with my singing? Every day, he repeated, and meant it. Zora nodded with satisfaction. Then I'm not worried. Changes are only scary if you have to do them alone. The wisdom from a 7-year-old hit Everett like a revelation. He'd spent years being afraid of change because change had meant loss, abandonment, falling further from grace. But this change was different. It was change he was choosing, change he was building toward, change that included people who cared about his success. The moving day arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. Elena organized their friends from the community. Murphy from the corner store, Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant, even some of the construction workers who'd gotten to know them during their transition. What should have been an overwhelming task became a neighborhood celebration of their new beginning. Zora insisted on personally carrying the doghouse from their temporary apartment to their new home, treating it like a sacred object that needed special care. She decorated it with flowers drawn in marker and a new sign that read, "Rex's House Forever Loved." It's not just a doghouse anymore, she explained to anyone who would listen. It's where our family started. It's important. History. Elena helped them arrange their modest furniture in the new space, creating cozy corners and designated areas for different activities. The kitchen table, where they'd share meals, and Zora would do homework. The living room where they could read. Together in the evenings. Everett's bedroom where he could prepare lesson plans once he started teaching again. But it was Zora's room that truly made the place feel like home. Elena had surprised them with new bedding, soft blue sheets with a pattern of musical notes. The neighborhood map from their temporary apartment found a place of honor on the wall, updated now to include their new address marked with a gold star. The doghouse sat in the corner, no longer a shelter from the storm, but a reminder of how far they'd traveled together. Tomorrow I start my new school and you start being a substitute teacher, Zora said as they tucked her into her new bed on their first night in the apartment. We're both going to be learning new things. Are you nervous? Everett asked. A little. But you know what I figured out? What? Being nervous means you care about doing something well, and caring about doing well means you're probably going to be okay. Everett smiled at this child who taught him more about resilience and hope than any philosophy book ever could. When did you get so wise? I learned it from you, she said matter-of-factly. You care about doing right by me, so I know you're going to be okay at teaching other kids too. As he turned off her light and closed her bedroom door, Everett felt the weight of tomorrow's possibilities settling around him like a familiar jacket. His first substitute teaching assignment was at Lincoln Elementary, fourth grade music class. Exactly. Where he'd started his career 20 years ago. Elena had stayed late to help them settle in, and he found her in the kitchen making tea and looking satisfied with the day's work. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. I don't know how we would have managed this without you." "Family helps family," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Besides, you two have given me more purpose than I've had since my husband died. I should be thanking you." They sat together at the kitchen table in their new home, drinking tea and talking quietly about the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Zora's first day at school, Everett's return to the classroom, the ongoing process of building a life that could sustain itself without constant crisis management. But tonight, they were simply three people who'd found each other in unlikely circumstances and chosen to become a family. The legal documents made it official. The new apartment made it real. But what made it true was the decision they made every day to keep showing up for each other. Outside their windows, the neighborhood settled into evening routines. But inside apartment 2B, three people who'd started as strangers were preparing for tomorrow with the confidence that comes from knowing you don't have to face the future alone. The brass key felt warm in Everett's palm as he stood outside apartment 2B with Zora and Elena, all of them carrying boxes that contained the sum total of their shared life. It was their official moving day, the transition from emergency housing to a real home, from temporary arrangement to permanent family. "This is it," Elena said softly, watching Everett fumble with the lock. "Your home." The word home still felt foreign in Everett's mouth, like a language he'd once spoken fluently but had forgotten through disuse. For 3 years, home had been whatever space he could claim for the night. For the past few months, it had been a borrowed apartment that belonged to social services. But this was theirs. Their names were on the lease. Their choices had selected the location. Their future would unfold within these walls. The door swung open to reveal the small but sunlit space they'd chosen together. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened onto a living area where afternoon light streamed through windows that faced east toward the neighborhood school. It wasn't grand, but it was clean and safe, and theirs. Zora dropped her box and ran straight to the windows, pressing her face against the glass to see the street below. "I can see the playground from here," she announced with satisfaction, "and the library down the block, and that's the store where Elena buys her coffee." She was mapping their new world, claiming it through observation and naming. This was how children took ownership of space, by identifying the landmarks that would anchor their daily routines, the places that would become familiar through repetition and use. Everett set his box down more carefully, still amazed by the simple act of carrying possessions into a place where they would stay. His box contained his few books, the coffee thermos that had sustained him through homeless mornings, his pitch pipe, and the newspaper clipping that Elena had helped him rediscover. Not much by most standards, but everything that mattered to him. "The doghouse goes in my room," Zora announced, directing the placement of their most precious cargo. "Right by the window so Rex can see outside." Elena smiled as she watched Zora orchestrate the arrangement of their belongings with the serious attention of someone who understood that where you put things mattered, that the placement of objects could create comfort or chaos, belonging or displacement. "She has good instincts," Eleanor murmured to Everett as they watched Zora carefully position the blue wooden structure in the corner where it would catch the morning light. Everett nodded, but he was struggling with an unexpected wave of emotion. The transition from survival to stability should have felt triumphant, but instead it felt overwhelming. After years of owning almost nothing, the simple act of having a closet to hang clothes in, a refrigerator to stock with food, a mailbox with his name on it, it was almost too much to process. "Hey," Elena said gently, noticing his expression. "You okay?" I keep waiting for someone to tell us we made a mistake, he admitted, that we can't actually do this, that it was all too good to be true. Elena understood. She'd seen this before. People who'd been knocked down so many times that success felt more frightening than failure, because failure was familiar, and success meant you had something new to lose. "You know what helped me after my husband died?" she said, "when everything felt too big and too permanent and too scary." Everett shook his head. "I focused on the next small thing. Not the whole rest of my life, just the next meal to cook, the next book to read, the next day to get through. Big changes happen one small moment at a time." As if summoned by Elena's wisdom, Zora appeared with her arms full of the kitchen supplies Elena had helped them choose. "Can we make dinner in our new kitchen tonight? I want to use all our new dishes." The request was so normal, so domestic, so much like what any child in any stable home might ask, that Everett felt his anxiety begin to ease. Yes, he could focus on making dinner. He could handle cooking pasta in their new kitchen, setting their small table with their thrift store dishes, creating the first of many ordinary meals in their extraordinary new life. "What do you want to make?" he asked. "Spaghetti," Zora said immediately, "with lots of Parmesan cheese, and we should light a candle because it's our first dinner in our real home." Elena clapped her hands together with delight. "A celebration. Dinner. Perfect. I'll run to the store and get supplies while you two finish getting settled." After Elena left, Everett and Zora worked together to arrange their few pieces of furniture and unpack their modest belongings. The apartment gradually transformed from empty space to lived-in home, as they found places for everything: Zora's books on the windowsill in her room, Everett's coffee thermos in the kitchen cabinet, their shared collection of sheet music that Elena had been helping them build on the living room bookshelf. "It feels different than the other place," Zora said, as she carefully arranged her stuffed animals on her new bed. "More like it's really ours." "What makes it feel that way?" Everett asked, genuinely curious about her perception of home and belonging. Zora considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I think it's because we picked it together. And because we're planning to stay. The other place was nice, but it was just where we were waiting. This is where we're going to live our life." The distinction she'd made between waiting and living struck Everett as profound. For too many years, he'd been waiting for his situation to improve, waiting for opportunities that never came, waiting for someone to give him permission to matter again. But Zora was right. They weren't waiting anymore. They were living, actively choosing each day how to build something meaningful from the raw materials of their shared affection and mutual commitment. When Elena returned with groceries and a bottle of sparkling cider for their celebration, she found them standing together in the kitchen, Everett showing Zora how to properly measure pasta while she practiced the rhythm of stirring sauce without splattering. "Now this," Elena said with satisfaction, "looks like home." That night, after their celebration dinner, and after Elena had gone home to her own apartment with promises to return the next day to help Zora get ready for her first day at the new school, Everett found himself standing in the doorway of Zora's room, watching her sleep in her own bed for the first time. She was curled on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant Sarah had given her face peaceful in the way that only comes with genuine security. The doghouse sat in the corner where she'd placed it, catching moonlight from the window and casting gentle shadows on the wall. The rainbow keychain with her copy of their apartment key lay on the nightstand beside her bed, a small symbol of ownership and belonging that she'd insisted on carrying with her everywhere since the day they'd received it. "It's proof that I live somewhere now," she'd explained with the matter-of-fact logic that had come to characterize so many of her observations about their life together. Everett pulled her door almost closed and walked to the living room, where he sat in the second-hand armchair Elena had helped them find, and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened to them. 6 months ago, he'd been a man with no address, No income, no prospects, and no reason to believe tomorrow would be different from today. Now he was someone's guardian, someone's family, someone who mattered enough to a little girl that she'd chosen to build her future around his presence. In her life, the transformation should have felt gradual, but it didn't. It felt sudden and complete, like waking up one morning to discover you'd become an entirely different person overnight. The man who'd slept in that alley felt like a stranger now, someone Everett could remember but not quite inhabit anymore. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Chen. "How's the first night in your new home? Everything okay?" He texted back, "Good. Zora's asleep. Still can't quite believe this is real." "It's real," came her immediate reply. "You both earned it. Sleep well." But sleep felt impossible with so much change racing through his mind. Tomorrow, Zora would start at Lincoln Elementary, the same school where he'd accepted a part-time position as music instructor thanks to Elena's advocacy and the positive response to the newspaper article about his case. They'd be in the same building for the first time since he'd become her guardian, and he wasn't sure how it would feel to be both her parent figure and her teacher's colleague. He got up and walked to the kitchen, where the evidence of their dinner still lingered. 2 plates in the dish drainer, the scent of garlic and parmesan in the air, the small candle they'd lit burning low in its holder. Such ordinary domestic details, but they felt miraculous to someone who'd forgotten what normal evening routines looked like. The candle flame reminded him of something Zora had said during dinner, when Eleanor had asked her what she was most looking forward to about their new life. "I want to have the same routine every day," she'd answered. "Like, I want to wake up in the same bed and eat breakfast at the same table and know that Mr. Everett Cole will be there when I get home from school. Every single day. Stability, predictability, the luxury of boring routine. These were the gifts she'd asked for. Not toys or adventures or anything elaborate, but simply the assurance that tomorrow would resemble today in its basic structure of safety and care." A soft sound from her room made him look up. Not crying, but the small murmur of dream talk that had become familiar during their months together. He went to check on her and found her sitting up in bed, looking disoriented in the way of someone caught between sleep and waking. "Hey," he said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Bad dream?" "No," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Good dream, I think. But then I woke up and didn't know where I was for a minute." "You're in your room," he reminded her gently. "In our apartment. Remember? We had spaghetti for dinner and lit the candle." Zora nodded, the familiar landmarks of their evening helping her anchor herself in the present moment. "I dreamed we were in the alley again, but it wasn't scary this time. Rex was there and he was happy about the doghouse. He said thank you for taking such good care of it." Everett felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That sounds like a very good dream." It was. He said he wasn't sad about being gone, because he knew I was taking care of you now, and you were taking care of me, and that's what families do. The simple wisdom of her dream logic, the idea that love creates connections that transcend physical presence, that care given to one being somehow honors all the beings who came before, struck Everett as profound in a way that made him grateful for the darkness that hid his tears. "Rex would be very proud of you," he said, "and he'd love knowing that his house helped bring us together." Zora lay back down, pulling her covers up to her chin with the satisfied movements of someone settling in for the rest of the night. "Mr. Everett Cole? Yeah? Are you happy, like really happy, not just okay happy?" The question was asked with the careful concern of someone who'd learned that adults didn't always say what they really felt, that sometimes you had to ask directly to get an honest answer. Everett considered the question seriously, taking inventory of his emotional state the way someone might check their pockets to see what they were carrying. Fear was there, about his return to teaching, about his ability to be the parent Zora deserved, about the fragility of their new stability. Gratitude was there too, overwhelming and constant, for Eleanor's friendship and Sarah's advocacy and the series of small miracles that had led them to this moment. But underneath everything else, stronger than the fear and more sustainable than the gratitude, was something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten its texture. Genuine contentment. Not the desperate happiness of someone who'd been saved from disaster, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found their place in the world. "Yeah," he said, and meant it completely. "I'm really happy." "Are you?" "The happiest I've ever been," she said without hesitation. "Even when I was little, before everything got complicated with Mama, I don't think I was this happy. This feels different, like it's going to last." "It is going to last," Everett said, and for the first time in years, he felt confident making that kind of promise. "Whatever else happens, what we've built together is going to last." Zora smiled in the darkness and closed her eyes, and within minutes her breathing had settled into the even rhythm of deep sleep. Everett sat beside her bed a little longer, watching over this child who'd somehow saved him from disappearing entirely, who'd reminded him that he was still capable of love and protection and all the daily acts of care that make life meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Zora's first day at school, his return to the classroom, the ongoing work of building a life that could sustain itself through ordinary difficulties as well as extraordinary blessings. But tonight, in their own home, with their own key and their own routines and their own small family of choice, everything felt exactly as it should be. 6 months later, Everett stood in the doorway of his classroom at Lincoln Elementary, watching his fourth-grade students pack up their instruments after their Friday afternoon music lesson. The familiar chaos of children organizing their belongings and chattering about weekend plans filled the room with the kind of purposeful noise that had once been the soundtrack of his daily life. Mr. Cole called Maria Santos, Elena's neighbor's granddaughter, who'd enrolled at Lincoln specifically to be in his class. "Can we work on the spring concert song again on Monday?" "Absolutely," Everett replied, straightening the stack of sheet music on his piano. "And remember, practice the harmony part we learned today. Your voices are getting stronger every week." The transformation had been gradual, but complete. His first day back in the classroom had been terrifying, his hands shaking as he introduced himself to students who had no idea about his years in the wilderness, his voice uncertain as he led them through their first warm-up exercises. But muscle memory had kicked in, and within minutes he'd remembered how to read the room, how to engage reluctant singers, how to create the kind of supportive environment where children felt safe to make noise and mistakes and music. The principal, Mrs. Williams, had been initially hesitant about hiring him despite the positive press coverage. But Elena's advocacy and Sarah's recommendation had convinced her to give him a chance, and the results spoke for themselves. Parent feedback was overwhelmingly positive, student engagement was high, and the upcoming spring concert promised to be the best Lincoln Elementary had produced in years. More importantly, teaching felt like coming home to himself. Every day in the classroom reminded him of who he'd been before the accusations had stripped away his identity and self-worth. He was still that person. The teacher who saw potential in every voice, who believed that music could reach children in ways that traditional academics sometimes couldn't, who understood that learning happened best in an atmosphere of patience and encouragement. As his students filed out of the classroom, backpacks bouncing and weekend plans being shouted across the hallway, Everett gathered his things and prepared to walk the 6 blocks home to the apartment where Zora would be waiting with homework questions and stories about her own school day. The walk had become his favorite part of the day, a transition between his professional life and his family. Life between being Mr. Cole, the music teacher, and being Everett, the guardian and father figure. The neighborhood had embraced them both in ways that still surprised him. Shopkeepers knew their names, other parents nodded with familiarity at school events, and their mailbox regularly contained invitations to birthday parties and community gatherings. Elena met him at the corner of their street, as she did most Fridays, carrying groceries for the weekend and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose volunteer work at the library had gone particularly well. "How was class?" "Today?" she asked, falling into step beside him. "Good. Really good. Maria's been working on her solo piece, and I think she's ready to perform it at the concert. Her confidence has grown so much since the beginning of the year. She talks about your class constantly," Elena said with a smile. "Her grandmother says she practices your songs at home every night, driving the whole family crazy with constant rehearsing." They turned onto their street, and Everett could see Zora in the window of their second-floor apartment, watching for his return as she did every afternoon. Her face lit up when she spotted him, and she waved enthusiastically before disappearing from view, probably running to the door to greet him. Their routine had settled into something comfortable and sustainable. Zora attended Lincoln Elementary, where she'd thrived academically and socially, making friends easily and impressing her teachers with her maturity and kindness. Afternoons were spent on homework at their kitchen table, while Everett prepared lessons for the next day, and evenings often included Elena for dinner and conversation. The legal aspects of their arrangement had been finalized 3 months ago, when the court granted Everett permanent guardianship after Zora's mother relinquished her parental rights from prison. It had been a bittersweet moment, closure that allowed them to plan for the future, but also final acknowledgement that Zora's original family couldn't provide the stability she needed. Zora had handled the news with characteristic wisdom, understanding that loving her mother didn't mean living with her was safe or healthy. "Some people love the best they can, but their best isn't good enough to take care of kids," she'd explained to Eleanor. "That doesn't make them bad people, but it means kids need to find other adults who can do better." Now, as Everett climbed the stairs to their apartment, he could hear Zora practicing piano, the second-hand keyboard that Elena had found at a church sale and that had become the centerpiece of their living room. She was working through a simple arrangement of Little Light, the song he'd written years ago for his students, adapting it for keyboard rather than voice. "I'm home," he called as he unlocked the door. "Perfect timing," Zora replied, without stopping her practice. "I figured out the tricky part in the middle, but I want you to check if I'm doing it right." This was their life now, ordinary and extraordinary, routine and magical. Homework help and music lessons, grocery shopping and school concerts, bedtime, stories and weekend adventures to the library or the park. The kind of family rhythms that most people took for granted, but that felt precious to both of them because they'd learned how easily such things could be lost. Elena joined them for dinner, as she often did on Fridays, bringing homemade dessert and stories from her volunteer work. They ate at their small kitchen table with the window open to let in the spring air, and Zora entertained them with detailed reports about her best friend's birthday party planning and her teacher's new bulletin board display. After Eleanor went home and Zora was tucked into bed with a book and her stuffed elephant, Everett sat in their living room with a cup of tea and looked around at the life they'd built together. The apartment was small but welcoming, filled with signs of their shared interests and daily routines. Zora's school artwork on the refrigerator, sheet music scattered across the coffee table, library books stacked on the windowsill. In the corner of Zora's room, visible through her partially open door, the doghouse sat in its place of honor by the window, no longer a shelter from the storm, but a reminder of the journey that had brought them together, a monument to resilience and the unexpected ways that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Chen, saw the article about your spring concert in the school newsletter. So proud of how far you've both come." He texted back, "Thank you for believing in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves." "That's what family does," came her immediate reply. Family. The word had expanded to include not just Zora, but Elena and Sarah, and even some of his fellow teachers and their neighbors, and the network of people who'd helped them build this life from nothing. Not the family he'd been born into or married into, but the family he'd chosen, and that had chosen him back, bound together not by genetics, but by care, not by obligation, but by love freely given and gratefully received. From Zora's room came the soft sound of her nighttime routine, the rustle of pages as she read a few more paragraphs, the squeak of springs as she settled deeper into her pillow, the contented sigh of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. Tomorrow would bring another ordinary, extraordinary day. Breakfast together, his walk to school, teaching music. To children who reminded him daily why he'd been meant for this work, coming home to Zora's questions and Elena's friendship and the simple miracle of having a place in the world that felt permanent and real. But tonight, sitting in his living room, with tea cooling in his hands and the sounds of his chosen family settling into sleep around him, Everett allowed himself to marvel at the distance they'd traveled from that rainy afternoon when a little girl had asked if she could sleep in a doghouse, and a broken man had found the courage to say yes. Sometimes the most broken people do find each other when they need it most. Sometimes a child's simple question really can crack open a heart that's been closed for years. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that cracking open is just the beginning of learning how much love you're actually capable of holding.